What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. The untold story of Molly Brown's unsinkability. Margaret Tobin Brown is still regarded as a hero in Colorado and even in the United States today because she was always upbeat, helpful, and hopeful. Before becoming obscenely wealthy, Margaret was born into a working-class family. She went on to become one of the most philanthropic socialites of her time. Today, she is best known as the steadfast Titanic survivor who not only supported the people in her lifeboat as the ship sank, but also rewarded brave people who helped others afterward and went on to do a lot of amazing good deeds. Margaret Brown has, in fact, grown to be larger than life as an American folk hero. Today, there are a number of myths about Margaret that have been eagerly fed to readers by historians and writers to make her appear even more flamboyant and mysterious than she really was. During her lifetime, for instance, she was never ever known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, confirms the Molly Brown House Museum in Denver. Writers Jean Fowler, Caroline Bancroft, and others gave her that name, and over time, their whimsical and sometimes fictitious tales about the lady became common knowledge. But even their portrayals of Margaret Brown really couldn't surpass the truth about the woman, whose life was far more interesting and noteworthy than any of the fibs told about her. Find out the truth about Molly Brown, the mysterious and charming character. Margaret Brown and how she got her start. Congress's Library. Margaret Brown was born in a 3-room tiny cottage in Hannibal, Missouri, in July 1867. John and Johanna Tobin already had 3 other children, and Margaret is listed as Maggie rather than Molly in the 1870 census. Margaret and her siblings, according to historic Missourians, attended a private school where their aunt taught through the 8th grade. Some have asserted that Maggie once rescued writer Mark Twain from drowning and played with him as a child. However, considering that Twain was already 32 years old when Margaret was born, that would have been an interesting trick. Margaret did, in fact, drop out of school when she was 13 and took a job at the Hannibal Garth tobacco factory to help support her family. However, Margaret also desired to move west after her half-sister Mary and her brother Daniel moved to Leadville, Colorado, in 1883. In 1886, when Daniel called her to Leadville, she got what she wanted. Margaret would be embarrassed to learn that she was portrayed as a Leadville saloon girl in the movie The Unsinkable Molly Brown. In fact, she ended up working as a seamstress for Daniels, Fisher and Smith dry goods, sewing draperies and other items. When she met John Joseph J.J., the man of her dreams, she was probably still there. Brown. Margaret elopes with J.J. Brown. Margaret was really opened up by Leadville. In this typical rough-and-tumble boomtown, miners labored to discover gold and silver. Margaret maintained her resilience by becoming a member of the Catholic Annunciation Church and volunteering for various charities and the local soup kitchen. She met J.J. quickly. Brown, an Irish descendant from another family, at a church picnic. One of the myths asserts that J.J. worked as a prospector at the Ibex Mining Company, when in fact he was employed as a mining engineer. Margaret thought he was a good enough candidate for marriage. Margaret's own descendants tell one story that J.J. Brown refused to go out with a woman when he showed up for their first date in a beat-up one-horse carriage. Margaret, on the other hand, preferred J.J.'s elegant 2-horse affair when he returned the following evening. According to Margaret's friend Thomas Cahill, everyone in Leadville thought it was a great match in either case. Margaret and J.J. tied the knot in September 1886 at the Annunciation Church, following a summer of courtship. Margaret was just 19 years old when Brown was 31. However, when the newlyweds set up housekeeping in J.J.'s tiny 2-room cabin in Stumptown, a mining community near Leadville, the union appeared to be permanent. J.J. and Margaret Brown's offspring, even prior to her wedding to J.J. Margaret Brown, understood the basics of being a mining man's wife. According to her biographer Kristen Iverson, she would later declare, "I loved Jim, but he was poor. I came to the conclusion that it would be better for me to be with a poor man I loved than with a wealthy man whose wealth had attracted me." Indeed, the couple would both recall that Margaret was able to take literature and music lessons during their happy early years together. She was also able to go back to Hannibal to give birth to her first child, Lawrence Larry Palmer Brown, in 1887, and the Browns bought a house in Leadville when she went back there. Catherine Helen Ellen Brown, Margaret's second child, was born in 1889, after several members of Margaret's family had relocated to Leadville. According to Encyclopedia Titanica, Margaret worked to help establish the Colorado chapter of the National American Woman's Suffrage Association, so the Browns bought a house that was even nicer. She also continued to help other mining families improve Leadville's schools by volunteering at the soup kitchen. According to biography, J.J. continued to advance within the mining company. Even though he struggled to ensure that miners could keep their jobs, he also disapproved in part of Margaret's progressive work to assist miners and their families. J.J. and Margaret Brown makes a fortune. Congress's library, an incident that would affect millionaires and silver miners across the West, occurred in 1893. In 1893, the Silver Purchase Act of 1890 was repealed, making silver the most valuable mineral in the United States. Leadville, like other silver mining towns, fell quickly as unemployment skyrocketed to 90%. Keep going. J.J. Brown came up with a way to get to the valuable gold, or that was in the Ibex's Little Johnny mine's bottom. The Little Johnny was producing 150 tons of ore per day at a rate of $25 in gold per ton, or $3,750, according to the Colorado Daily Chieftain in December. As it turned out, the Molly Brown House Museum claims that J.J. Since Brown already owned a portion of the Ibex Mining Company, the Little Johnny's success was directly attributed to him, particularly when the mine produced the largest vein of gold ever discovered in North America. As a result, his friends at the Ibex gave him 12,500 shares of stock and a seat on the board of directors. The account of Margaret accidentally burning the Brown family fortune in the family home's wood stove can be credited to historian Caroline Bancroft. That did not occur. Margaret admitted that she kept coins in the stove but never intentionally burned them. Denver is where the Browns move. Margaret and J.J. struck it rich within a year. As shown, Brown moved to Denver. Isaac and Mary Large, who ironically lost their fortune in the Silver Purchase crash, gave them their elegant home at 1340 Pennsylvania Avenue. The price was $30,000, which is now close to $1 million. But Margaret couldn't help but notice how the silver crash had affected other people, and how poor the slums around the downtown area were. She was involved in the founding of the Denver Women's Club in 1895, which was part of a national network that worked to make women and children's lives better. J.J. continued to acquire land in southwest Denver as Margaret pursued her causes. He started building the Avoca Lodge in 1895, a 400-acre estate that became the Browns' summer home when it was finished in 1897. In addition to serving as a haven for the family, the Avoca hosted extravagant parties at which guests danced the night away on an oak dance floor. Margaret balanced her time entertaining by looking after her mother and others who lived with the Browns by the time of the 1900 census. Also in 1900, she furthered her education by attending New York's Carnegie Institute for a year to learn an amazing 5 languages: French, German, Italian, Russian and Spanish, as well as literature and drama. Louise Hill vs. Margaret Brown Women of Consequence claims that the Browns frequently appeared in newspapers, where reporters noted where they went, what they wore, who they hung out with, and the parties they hosted. Margaret's contributions to the construction of the Immaculate Conception Cathedral for St. according to the Molly Brown House Museum, her support for the construction of additional playgrounds to keep children out of trouble, her founding of the Denver Dumb Friends League, and her support for the construction of more playgrounds did not go unnoticed. The museum does, however, maintain that because the Browns were new money, they were not always invited to functions with other wealthy Denver citizens, yet they were never outright snubbed. But is that truly the case? Most stories of Margaret being snubbed by Denver society are attributed in part to Caroline Bancroft, who called our heroine such a fraud. She lied about everything. At the bottom of Bancroft's claim to Margaret being ostracized is Louise Hill, whose husband, Crawford, was quite wealthy. The Denver Post says that Louise, who runs her own club called the Sacred 36, could make or break anyone with social ambitions. According to History Colorado, the roster included some of the wealthiest wives in Denver, but Margaret Brown was left off because of her unruly behavior, Catholic faith, and new money status. Margaret, on the other hand, referred to Louise as the snobbiest Denver woman. Louise Hill would not have to face Margaret Brown until years later. The marriage of Maggie Brown goes south. Undaunted by Louise Hill or anyone else, Margaret Brown continued her philanthropic efforts. She decided to run for state senate in 1901, which was completely shocking even in the early Edwardian era. According to the Molly Brown House Museum, J.J. seemed particularly frightened by the whole situation, which may have led Margaret to withdraw from the race. After that, the couple set out on an extensive trip around the world, stopping in places like France, India, Ireland, Japan, and Russia, among others. The trip significantly rejuvenated the Browns' marriage, and Margaret even wrote articles about India's caste system that were published in Denver newspapers. The Leadville Herald-Democrat reported that Mary Ann Tobin, Margaret's brother Daniel's wife, passed away in Pueblo in 1903. Margaret adopted Mary and Daniel's 3 daughters and raised them as if they were her own. Despite the Brown family's love, there was still something off about the house. J.J. sold the Avoca Lodge, shown in photo, in 1906. According to biography, he continued to reject Margaret's outspoken efforts, to the point where the couple secretly split up in 1909. According to Britannica, the agreement was fairly amicable, with Margaret maintaining ownership of the Browns' Denver property and receiving a $25,000 trust fund with monthly distributions of $700. Margaret was able to continue working because it was sufficient, and she did so, even running for Congress several times between 1909 and 1914. The Titanic's night out for Margaret Brown. The unsinkable ship the Titanic, which sank just hours after it collided with an iceberg on April 14, 1912, is well known to history buffs. Margaret, who had arrived in France, was on board that ship. Catherine's daughter, was supposed to board the boat in England but missed it. Margaret recalled that Colonel John Jacob Astor and his wife tried to board lifeboat number 6 alongside her and other passengers. Despite his wife's fragile health, the 3 seamen in the lifeboat ordered the colonel to leave the boat. He died later in the icy water. Margaret was extremely concerned, according to Stephanie L., the writer. Barksuski. She and other women pleaded with Quartermaster Robert Hitchens to assist in their rescue, but he declined. Additionally, he ignored their pleas for them to row to keep warm. Margaret eventually got to the stern and took Hitchens' tiller, threatening to throw him overboard if he got involved. According to the Molly Brown House Museum, she did not, as depicted in the movie, strip to her corset and wave a gun around. However, once she was aboard the RMS Carpathia, she made loud complaints about the men's refusal to assist her to the newspapers. Margaret and other women began providing clothing and other necessities to other survivors the following morning. The impossible Mrs. Brown. According to the New World Encyclopedia, by the time the Carpathia entered New York Harbor, Margaret and her friends had raised $10,000 for the Titanic survivors. Margaret told reporters that she survived the Titanic because she had typical Brown luck, according to Findegrave. "We are unstoppable." Polly Pry, a gossip columnist for the Denver Post, referred to Margaret as the unsinkable Mrs. according to the Molly Brown House Museum. Brown. Margaret, on the other hand, increased her fundraising efforts to honor Captain Rostron and his crew of the Carpathia. Margaret herself, on behalf of her fellow survivors, gave Rostron a loving cup. The Titanic Historical Society claims that she also presented the officers and crew of the Carpathia with approximately 300 medals, 14 of which were solid gold. Margaret Brown became a hero to Americans as word of her heroic deeds and acts of kindness spread. That part is true in every way. Margaret was content with her new fame. According to history, she wrote to Catherine with glee, "After being brined, salted, and pickled in the middle of the ocean, I am now high and dry. I have received flowers, letters, telegrams, and even people until I am lost. They are requesting a medal from Congress. Due to my status as heroine of the Titanic, I may need to consult a medical professional to examine my head." Margaret did not win a congressional medal, but she did win something that was very important to her: an invitation to a luncheon that Louise Hill had planned just for her. After the Titanic, Margaret Brown's heroism did not end. Margaret was careful with her hard-earned power. The women of the camp pleaded with Margaret for assistance in 1914 after striking coal miners at the company-owned town of Ludlow, pictured, were brutally attacked, killing 8 men and injuring 11 women and children. Once more, the woman took action and raised funds to send nurses, shoes, and clothing to Ludlow. She also managed to convince John D. Rockefeller, persuaded him to travel to Colorado and resolve the strike. Margaret eventually increased her time spent at her Rhode Island summer home. She gave a speech at the Conference of Great Women in 1914, where she continued her work with women's suffrage campaigns. She also ran a campaign for the Colorado senatorial seat once more, but on the advice of her constituents, she pulled out of the race. Margaret focused instead on working with the American Committee for devastated France when World War I broke out. He passed away in 1922. "I've never met a man who is better, bigger, or more valuable than J.J. Brown," Margaret said. In addition, despite the fact that Encyclopedia Titanica and other websites assert that J.J. did not leave a will naming Margaret as executrix of his estate and pitting Margaret against her own children for the inheritance, J.J. did actually file a will. Another rumor has been squashed. Margaret Brown turns to acting. Margaret continued to travel after J.J. passed away. Historic Missourians claim that she was staying in a Florida hotel when it caught fire and led her fellow guests to safety down the fire escape. It's hard to say whether that story is true, but it is a fact that late in her life Margaret pursued another of her lifelong interests: acting. According to her biography, she appeared in a play called L'Aiglon in both Paris and New York. Edmond Rostand wrote the play in 1900, and actress Sarah Bernhardt played the title role. In a rerun of the play, Margaret imitated Bernhardt. Margaret was also recognized for her work as an actress. She received the French Legion of Honor in 1932 for both her work during World War I and her assistance to Titanic survivors. On the evening of October 25, a contented Margaret Brown retired her room at the Barbizon Hotel in New York, which also housed other aspirant actors. She did not awaken, likely passing away in her sleep as she dreamed of her many accomplishments in the past and in the future. According to the bio, the brain tumor that was not found was the cause of death. In the New York City Cemetery of the Holy Rood, she is buried close to J.J. Margaret lives on in our memories. Would the unsinkable Mrs. Should Brown be content that she was larger in death than she was in life? Possibly, as the woman has received numerous accolades. Margaret has been the subject of at least 10 biographies, and in 1960, producers Lawrence Langner, Armina Marshall, and Dor Shari staged the play The Unsinkable Molly Brown at the Winter Garden Theatre in New York. The play continues to appear on the playbills of theaters across the United States today, starring actress Tammy Grimes from the original production. Then there is the 1964 film with the same name, starring Debbie Reynolds, which won 3 Oscars out of 6 nominations and primarily based on Margaret's myths. Visitors to the Molly Brown Birthplace Museum in Hannibal, Missouri, which is still furnished as it was during Margaret Brown's time and tells the story of her early life, can get a more accurate look at Margaret Brown's life. In 1970, the luxurious Brown residence on Pennsylvania Street in Denver was saved from demolition and transformed into the Molly Brown House Museum, pictured. The museum continues to be committed to enhancing the city's unique identity by telling of Margaret's prolific influence on American politics and philanthropy, according to the website, which states that it receives approximately 45,000 visitors annually. Margaret, who was inducted into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame in 1985, is honored in both museums in remarkable ways. Margaret Tobin Brown, better known to the world as Unsinkable Molly Brown, was more than just a brave Titanic survivor with a catchy nickname and a brassy musical to her name. She was also a complex, ambitious, socially conscious, and fiercely independent woman whose life story is far more fascinating than the majority of fictionalized versions would have you believe. Margaret, who was often referred to as Maggie in her youth, was born in 1867 in a cramped 3-room cottage in Hannibal, Missouri, to working-class Irish immigrants John and Johanna Tobin. She was raised in modest circumstances, surrounded by siblings, and grounded in faith and family values. Contrary to later Hollywood myths, she did not spend her childhood jogging along the riverbanks with Mark Twain or saving him from drowning. In fact, Twain was an adult when Margaret was born. She left school at the age of 13 like many other girls her age and worked in a tobacco factory to support her family, but she always looked westward for opportunities. Margaret moved with her siblings to Leadville, Colorado, in 1886. She worked in a dry goods store instead of a saloon, as Hollywood later imagined. She met James Joseph J.J., the love of her life, in Leadville. Brown, a mining engineer from Ireland who was raised in the United States, wooed her with charm, determination, and eventually a classier car. Even though Margaret was only 19 years old and J.J. was 31 years old, the two got married that same year in the local Catholic church. They quickly started a life together in a humble miner's cabin near the Rockies' booming silver mines. Margaret was a tireless volunteer for soup kitchens, schools, and the early women's suffrage movement after having two children, Lawrence in 1887 and Catherine in 1889. She often got into arguments with her more conservative husband, who quietly disapproved of her progressive activism even as he advanced in the mining industry. J.J. Brown miraculously discovered a massive gold deposit in the Ibex Mining Company's Little Johnny mine during the 1893 silver panic, which made the Browns Colorado millionaires right away. Margaret never intentionally burned a stack of company stocks in her wood stove, despite the fact that she reportedly used it to conceal coins, contrary to popular belief. The Browns bought a $30,000 Denver mansion from a couple who had been bankrupted by the same silver crash that had started their fortune. Margaret, on the other hand, leaned into her activism rather than retreating into the insulated world of the nouveau riche. She founded the Denver Women's Club, advocated for juvenile justice reform, and established educational and health programs for the city's poor. She traveled extensively throughout Europe, meeting royalty, artists, and intellectuals, and she studied languages, music, and literature. However, Margaret's marriage began to fall apart as a result of J.J. becoming dissatisfied with her growing independence, despite her social ascent. In 1909, the couple broke up on good terms, but they never got a divorce. When J.J. died, he left Margaret a monthly allowance and property. Margaret's bravery would land her on the ill-fated RMS Titanic in 1912, making her a historical figure. She not only demanded that her lifeboat return to search for survivors as the ship sank, but she also took charge of morale and logistics, encouraging the rowers and giving blankets to the shocked passengers. She organized support for second- and third-class passengers who would have been abandoned by the White Star Line and raised thousands of dollars in the chaos that followed the disaster to assist the plight of the surviving survivors. Her spirit was praised by the media, but she wasn't given the moniker Unsinkable Molly Brown until decades later. She wasn't called Molly when she was alive, and she probably didn't like the overly theatrical image it brought to mind.